somewhere in the hill country of central Virginia, in a county seat that barely warranted a name on most maps of the 1840s. A surveyor named Elias Corder was hired to confirm the boundary lines of a land grant that had passed through 4 generations of the same family. The work was routine, or so it was supposed to be. But when Corder pulled the framed map from the wall of the old county clerk's office, the one that had hung there since before anyone in town could remember, he found something that stopped him cold. Behind that map, pressed flat and folded into a near-perfect square, was a second map. Older, drawn in a different hand, covering the same territory but showing roads that had never been built, property lines that didn't match any deed on record, and, at the center, a marking that no one in that office could explain. A large parcel of land, nearly 400 acres, that bore no owner's name. Only a symbol, a small, careful drawing of an iron key. Within a week, 3 men who had seen that second map were dead. Within a month, the map itself had vanished from the county records. And the land it depicted, that nameless 400 acres, remained, to this day, beyond the edge of what most people in that county were ever willing to discuss out loud. Before we continue with the story of Elias Corder and the buried map of Greystone County, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And tell us in the comments, what state are you watching from tonight? The answer to what that map was hiding required digging into the kinds of records that powerful men in antebellum Virginia had very good reasons to keep buried. To understand what Elias Corder stumbled into, you have to understand what Virginia looked like in the 1840s. Not the Virginia of textbooks, with its rolling plantations and stately porticos, but the Virginia that existed just beneath that surface. The one built on arrangements that were never meant to be written down, on boundaries drawn in private meetings rather than courtrooms, on agreements sealed with handshakes between men who trusted silence more than law. Greystone County, the name used here to protect the specific location, which remains a matter of some sensitivity among local historians, sat in the central Piedmont, far enough from Richmond to operate with a degree of independence, close enough to feel the reach of the state's political machinery when it suited those in power. It was tobacco country gone partly to seed by the 1840s. The land exhausted after 2 generations of monoculture farming. The soil thin and reddish-brown and prone to washing out in heavy rains. The county seat had a courthouse, 2 taverns, a general store, a church of the Baptist persuasion, and a population of perhaps 900 white citizens registered in the 1840 census, along with an unregistered and largely invisible population of enslaved men and women whose numbers were nearly equal. The county clerk at the time was a man named Harwell Pruitt. He had held the position for 11 years, inheriting it in a manner that was never entirely explained. The previous clerk had retired suddenly and relocated to Kentucky with notable haste, leaving behind very few personal belongings and no forwarding correspondence. Pruitt was meticulous, fastidious in his dress, and deeply averse to questions he hadn't prepared answers for. He wore his authority lightly but absolutely, the way men do when they know they are protected from above by something more durable than mere reputation. The courthouse building itself was a 2-story brick structure that had been expanded in 1831. The new wing connected to the old by a covered walkway that always seemed slightly out of alignment with the main building, as though the 2 parts had been built by men who couldn't quite agree on where the walls should go. The records room occupied the back half of the ground floor, with tall windows that let in the morning light and kept the afternoon dim, and wooden shelves that ran floor to ceiling, packed with ledgers, deed books, plat maps, and the administrative detritus of 3/4 of a century of county governance. The map on the wall, the one that would eventually come down, had hung in the records room for as long as anyone could say with certainty. It showed the county in what appeared to be the early survey work from around the time of statehood, the property lines clean and confident in the way that early surveys rarely were in practice. It was the kind of map that visitors remarked upon, that county officials pointed to when they needed to show a constituent where their land began and where it ended. It had the aura of authority, and it looked like the truth. Elias Corder arrived in the county seat on a Tuesday in late September of 1847. He was a surveyor of moderate reputation and considerable experience, having worked for 2 decades across Virginia and into the western reaches of the state. He was 41 years old, a compact and precise man who kept his equipment in immaculate order and his opinions largely to himself. He had been hired by a widow named Dorothea Farwell to confirm the boundaries of the land her late husband's family had held for 4 generations, a parcel of some 230 acres that abutted the properties of 3 neighboring landowners, one of whom had recently begun asserting that the eastern fence line was 40 rods further west than the Farwell deed claimed. The dispute itself was ordinary enough. Boundary conflicts were among the most common legal headaches in rural Virginia, particularly on land that had been subdivided and sold and inherited and sometimes forfeited over generations without anyone ever bothering to have it properly resurveyed. What was not ordinary was what Corder found when he began checking the official county plat maps against the field measurements he had taken over his first 2 days of work. The numbers didn't match. Not in a minor way. Not the kind of discrepancy you could attribute to instrument error or the shifting of fence posts over decades. The eastern boundary of the Farwell property, according to the large map on the courthouse wall, ran along a creek bed that Corder's measurements placed nearly 60 rods east of where the map showed it. 60 rods was not a clerical error, and 60 rods was a deliberate difference. Corder requested access to the records room to examine the original survey documentation, and Clerk Pruitt granted it with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was on the afternoon of his second day in the records room that Corder noticed the frame. He had been working at the long wooden table beneath the windows, comparing deed book entries against the measurements in his field journal, when the afternoon light shifted. A cloud crossing the sun, or perhaps simply the angle of the light moving through the day. And for a moment, the large map on the wall cast a shadow onto the wall behind it that was slightly larger than the map itself. Corder thought nothing of it at first. He returned to his ledgers. But after a while, in the way that an incongruity lodges itself in a careful man's mind, he found himself looking back at the map. The frame was thick, thicker than you would need to simply mount a map on a wall. The kind of thickness that suggested either excessive craftsmanship or the presence of something behind the visible surface. Corder was not a man given to dramatic conclusions, but he was a surveyor, a man trained to notice when surfaces don't correspond to the structures underneath them. He waited until the clerk's assistant, a young man named Pettis, had gone to fetch water from the well in the courthouse yard. Then he climbed onto one of the wooden chairs, gripped the heavy frame at both upper corners, and lifted. The frame was not attached to the wall. It had simply been resting against a pair of iron nails, its own considerable weight holding it in place. It came down slowly and awkwardly, and Corder had to lower it to the floor in stages, pressing it against his chest and walking it down the wall rather than lifting it free all at once. When it was finally flat on the floor, he turned it over. Behind the county map, pressed between the map's backing and a thin sheet of oilcloth that had been nailed around the inner edges of the frame, was a second document. It had been folded 4 times, creased with great care, and kept dry by the oilcloth wrapping. When Corder unfolded it on the table, pressing the corners flat with his palms, He found himself looking at a hand-drawn map of the county's western quarter. Older than the one on the wall, the paper had a different texture, a warmer tone, the ink slightly faded but still legible. The draftsmanship was more careful than the official map. If anything, the lines more precisely ruled, the notations written in a smaller, more deliberate hand. The property lines it showed were different. Not dramatically different across most of the territory, but significantly different in one specific area, a large, irregular parcel in the western reaches of the county, near where the land rose toward the first foothills of the Blue Ridge. According to this hidden map, that parcel comprised approximately 400 acres. It was bounded on 3 sides by named watercourses, and on the 4th by a road that the official map did not show. And unlike every other parcel on the hidden map, which bore either an owner's name or a notation indicating crown or state land, this one was blank except for the symbol at its center. The key, drawn small and precise, with the careful detail of a man who meant it as a mark of specific significance, not mere decoration. Corder sat at that table for a long time. He was still sitting there, the hidden map spread before him. When Harwell Pruitt himself came into the records room rather than his assistant, and stopped in the doorway and looked at the official map lying face down on the floor, and then at the hidden map on the table, and at Corder. The clerk's face did something complicated, something that moved through surprise and calculation and arrived at a kind of careful stillness. "I see you've been thorough," Pruitt said. "The frame was resting loose," Corder said. "I noticed the depth." "Indeed." Pruitt came into the room slowly and stood across the table from Corder. He looked at the hidden map for a long moment without touching it. "These old buildings hold all manner of things between their walls. I expect that document has been there since before my tenure." He paused. "Perhaps before my predecessor's tenure." "Do you know what the symbol means?" Corder asked. "The key marking." Pruitt looked at it again. Something moved behind his eyes. "I do not," he said, in the tone of a man who has decided that the most effective lie is a very short one. Corder folded the hidden map, placed it at the edge of the table, and made a notation in his field journal. Not of what he had found, but of the time, the date, the light conditions in the room. The kind of notation that a careful man makes when he suspects he may need to account later for exactly where he was and what he observed. For he left the courthouse that evening and returned to his room at the larger of the 2 taverns. He sat up late writing a letter to a colleague in Richmond, a man named Solomon Trask, who had surveyed the western quarter of the county some 20 years earlier. He described the hidden map in detail and asked Trask what he knew about any survey work in that part of the county that might have been conducted outside of the official record. He sealed the letter and arranged for it to be taken to the post road the following morning. He was still asleep when someone entered his room in the night. He heard nothing. He would later tell his daughter, in a letter written from another county in another state, on several years after the events in Greystone, that he had woken just before dawn with the strong and unshakable sense that someone had been in his room while he slept. His field journal, which he had placed on the writing table beside his bed, was in a slightly different position. Not dramatically different. Just rotated a few degrees, the spine no longer parallel to the table's edge, the way it always was when he set it down. The notation he had made in the records room was intact. The letter he had written to Solomon Trask was gone. Not taken violently, simply gone. The place where he had left it beside the journal now empty. The seal he had pressed onto the wax, leaving a faint impression in the wood of the table where it had rested. Solomon Trask never received Corder's letter. Whether it was intercepted before it reached the post road or somewhere along the route, or whether Trask received it and was persuaded by means that Trask never made explicit. To deny having done so is a question that the surviving record cannot answer. What is known is that when Corder attempted to contact Trask again through a mutual colleague some weeks later, Trask responded only that he had no correspondence from Corder and no knowledge of any unofficial survey work in Greystone County's western quarter. Trask died in the winter of 1848, 4 months after Corder's visit to the courthouse. The cause of death was listed as a fever that had been going through Richmond that season. He was 63 and had been in reasonably good health. His wife reported to the colleague who inquired that Trask had received a visitor at his home 2 weeks before he fell ill. A man she had not seen before and did not see again, who had come alone and spent nearly 2 hours in Trask's study. Trask had been quiet for several days after that visit, she said. Not his usual quiet, but a different kind. The quiet of a man trying to decide something. The second death was a farmer named Obadiah Lacey, who worked land in the western quarter of the county, adjacent to the area shown on the hidden map. Lacey had been in the records room on a routine matter, some question about a road easement across his property, on the same afternoon that Corder had found the hidden map. He had seen it on the table, though it is not clear how much of it he had read. He died in October of 1847. He was struck by a wagon on the main road through town in what 3 witnesses described as an accident. The wagon driver was from out of county. He did not stay for the inquest. The third man was Pettis, the clerk's assistant who had been sent to the well while Corder examined the frame. It is uncertain whether Pettis had seen the hidden map at all. He had not been in the room when Corder pulled it from the frame and had returned to find the clerk and the surveyor in what he later described to a cousin as a very still kind of conversation. Pettis died in late November of 1847 of causes that the county physician, a Dr. Nathaniel Good, certified as consistent with putrid fever. Good had examined him only once, for less than an hour, and had not been called to attend him in any previous illness. Corder completed his survey of the Farwell property, the original reason for his visit, and submitted his findings to Dorothea Farwell and her attorney. His findings confirmed that the eastern boundary ran where the Farwell deed said it ran, and not where the neighboring landowner had claimed. He submitted no official report regarding the hidden map and made no formal inquiry to the county clerk or any other official party. He left Greystone County in early October of 1847 and did not return. But he did not simply let the matter drop. Over the following years, in letters to several trusted colleagues and in a series of private notebooks that his daughter would eventually donate to a historical archive in another state, Corder assembled what he could of the history of the Western Quarter. The land marked on the hidden map, the 400 acres with the iron key at its center. What he found was a history of deliberate silence, of records that existed in one ledger and not in another, of transactions that had been recorded and then, apparently, unrecorded, of a piece of land that showed up in no tax roll and no census enumeration and no deed book in the county, and yet which was clearly occupied, or at least managed, based on the testimony of several people who had worked or traveled near it. The land was not empty. It never had been. And the reason it bore no name in any official record had nothing to do with clerical oversight. It had to do with what the land was for. To follow Corder's reconstruction, you have to understand something about how certain kinds of business were conducted in antebellum Virginia. There were operations that benefited enormously from the formal protections of law, property rights, contract enforcement, the power of courts to compel compliance, while at the same time being of a nature that powerful men preferred not to have committed to official documents in any specific or traceable way. The solution, in many cases, was to build a parallel architecture of record-keeping documents that existed were binding among those who held them, but which were kept out of the county registers, out of the deed books, out of any repository that might be subject to outside scrutiny. Virginia had a long tradition of exactly this kind of private legal architecture. The colonial period had established patterns of gentleman's agreement and informal compact that coexisted alongside the formal legal system, not in defiance of it, but woven through it, using the official structures where they were useful and bypassing them where they were inconvenient. By the antebellum period, this tradition had become, in certain circles, a highly refined practice. Families who had been in Virginia for 4 or 5 generations had accumulated not just land and wealth, but institutional knowledge, a deep understanding of how the legal system worked, and more importantly, where its seams were. Where you could press and find it gave way, where the clerk would look and where he wouldn't, where the circuit court judge would ask questions and where he understood that questions were not expected of him. The men who built the arrangement that Corder had stumbled across were not by any external measure lawbreakers. They attended their churches, and they paid their taxes on the land they officially held. They served in the legislature and on the county court and in the vestries of their episcopal parishes. They were the law in many of the ways that mattered, which meant that they understood better than anyone how to use the law's own mechanisms to protect what they needed to protect. The iron key symbol, Corder eventually determined, was not unique to the hidden map in Greystone County. He found references to it, oblique references, never explicit, in correspondence from at least 2 other counties in central Virginia. In each case, the reference appeared in connection with property transactions of an unusual nature. Large parcels, substantial sums, and a consistent pattern of the official record showing the land as either unclaimed or belonging to the state, while private documents, letters, personal accounts, financial ledgers, referred to productive activity on the same land. A colleague in Lynchburg who had done survey work across the central Piedmont told Corder, in a letter written in 1849, that he had once been asked to conduct a private survey, not to be filed with any county clerk, of a parcel in a neighboring county. The man who hired him had paid him twice the normal rate, in cash, and had asked him to deliver the survey plat directly to an address in Richmond rather than to any local official. The parcel, when Corder's colleague described its location, corresponded almost exactly to a section of land that appeared on the official county map as unclaimed bottomland. The man who hired me, the colleague wrote, was not the sort of man one asks questions of. He had the manner of someone accustomed to having his instructions followed without discussion. I completed the work, delivered the plat, and heard nothing more. I have since found it wiser not to inquire. There was one detail in the colleague's letter that Corder underlined twice in his notebook and returned to in his writings over the following years. The man who had commissioned the private survey had left behind, in the pocket of the oilcloth case he used to carry the completed plat, a small sheet of folded paper that the colleague had found only after the man had gone. On that paper, in the same careful hand that had appeared on the commission documents, was a list of initials, 7 of them arranged in a column, and beside each set of initials, a number. The colleague had not known what the initials represented. He had not known what the numbers meant. But he had kept the paper, because a careful man keeps things he doesn't understand, against the possibility that understanding may one day be useful. He sent the paper to Corder along with his letter. Corder spent the better part of a winter matching those initials to names in the Greystone County deed books and in the records of the state legislature. 6 of the 7 he was able to identify with reasonable confidence. They were the names of men from 5 different central Virginia counties, prominent men, several of whom held or had recently held public office. The numbers beside each set of initials were, Corder eventually concluded, financial figures, not the total value of any single transaction, but shares, proportional stakes in a larger arrangement whose total value he estimated, or very roughly, at somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, a substantial sum for the 1840s, enough to fund a sustained, well-organized operation over many years. Corder spent 2 years building a picture from these fragments. What that picture showed, when it began to come into focus, was not what he had initially suspected. He had assumed, in those first weeks after leaving Greystone County, that the hidden map represented a straightforward land fraud, some scheme by which powerful families had quietly appropriated county land for their own use while keeping it off the tax rolls. That would have been serious enough. But the truth, as Corder came to understand it, was both more complex and far darker. The 400 acres were not primarily a financial arrangement. They were a management arrangement. And in Virginia in the 1840s, the movement of enslaved people was one of the most carefully managed aspects of plantation economics. Enslaved men and women could be sold, hired out, transferred, held as collateral, mortgaged, and traded in ways that the law both enabled and, to some degree, constrained. But there were aspects of this management that even the most permissive legal framework created awkwardness around, particularly when the men involved belonged to prominent families, held political office, or had reputations to protect in the drawing rooms of Richmond and Washington. Consider the specific legal complications that could arise from an estate in transition. When a patriarch died, his enslaved people became part of the estate. Subject to probate, potentially visible to creditors, listed in inventories that became part of the court record. If that estate had debts, creditors could petition for access to the estate's human property. If the will was contested among heirs, the disposition of enslaved people became subject to litigation. If there were mortgages, and there were always mortgages, the plantation economy ran on credit. The mortgagees had legal claims that could, in theory, be pressed. In theory. In practice, the men who held those mortgages and the men who controlled those estates were often the same class of people, connected by the same web of family relationships, business partnerships, and social obligations. They managed these complications informally, among themselves, without resort to the courts when they could avoid it. But sometimes the complications outran the informal management, and sometimes a transaction needed to happen. Needed to happen quickly, needed to happen without any paper trail that might be discoverable. And there was no clean legal mechanism for it. That was what the 400 acres were for. The land marked with the iron key was, Corder came to believe, a kind of intermediary space, a holding place, a piece of territory that officially did not exist in any legal record, and therefore could not be the subject of any legal inquiry, where certain transactions and certain people could be kept without appearing in any document that might be subpoenaed, examined, or later introduced as evidence. The families whose money and whose instructions had created and maintained this space were not minor figures. Their names appeared in the state legislature, in the circuit courts, in the registers of the most prominent churches in Richmond. Their land holdings were documented extensively and publicly, all except for this one piece, carefully excised from the official record, maintained through a separate system of private instruments that circulated only among themselves. And the key symbol, Corder eventually determined, was how they marked the documents that belonged to that parallel system. An iron key. A simple image that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know what it meant, and everything to those who did. The enslaved people held on that 400 acres had no legal existence in the county where they lived and worked and were confined. They appeared in no census, They were included in no estate inventory that would be filed with a county court. If they were sick, no county physician would be officially called to treat them. If they died, no county register would record their death. They existed in a space that the law had effectively rendered invisible. Not because the law didn't apply to them, but because the men who controlled both the land and the law had arranged things so that the law simply had no occasion to look. This was not, Corder was careful to note in his private notebooks, a unique arrangement. It was an extreme and particularly well-organized version of practices that existed in various forms across the antebellum South. What made the Greystone situation distinctive was the degree of coordination it represented, the number of prominent families involved, the sophistication of the parallel record-keeping system, and, most significantly, is what happened when the arrangement began to come under threat. In the spring of 1851, 3 years after Corder had left Greystone County, a Methodist circuit preacher named Josiah Drummond began traveling through the county's western quarter. Drummond was not a man who went looking for trouble. He was in his mid-40s, a circuit rider who had worked the Virginia Piedmont for 15 years. A man of sincere, if uncomplicated faith, who saw his role as bringing the word to people in isolated rural areas who had no regular access to church services. He had grown up in western North Carolina, the son of a mill owner who had given him a reasonable education and a strong opinion about the moral obligations of a Christian man. He was not by temperament or by theology a man inclined toward confrontation. He had accommodated himself, as most ministers in his position had, to the social arrangements of the communities he served. He did not preach against slavery from any pulpit he occupied. He baptized the children of enslaved people when he was asked to, and said words over their dead when he was allowed, and did not, in the ordinary course of his circuit riding, ask questions about the arrangements of the families whose farms he visited. He was, in other words, a man shaped entirely by the pressures of his world, which made what he did in the weeks after his visit to the Western Quarter all the more remarkable and, in retrospect, all the more costly. What Drummond encountered on a Tuesday morning in May of 1851 was something he spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of. He had taken a shortcut, or what he had been told was a shortcut, across a stretch of land in the western part of the county, traveling between two farm communities he visited on his regular circuit. The path led him through a section of woods that had been partially cleared, and at the edge of the clearing, he came upon a cluster of rough structures, not quite cabins, something smaller and less permanent, and a garden plot, and a well, and perhaps 30 people in various states of occupation, some working in the garden, some carrying water, some sitting in the shade of the largest structure. A few children, several older men and women, mostly younger adults. None of them showed any surprise at seeing him. Some of them looked at him with what he would later describe as a kind of exhausted caution. The expression of people who have learned that surprise is a luxury they cannot afford. Drummond dismounted. He introduced himself. He said he was a minister of the Methodist persuasion, and that he was traveling between communities on his circuit. He asked if they had received any ministry recently, which was the standard opening question of a man in his position. No one answered immediately. The older woman who eventually came forward did so with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned to be very careful about who she spoke to and what she said. She was perhaps 60 years old, on with a face that held the specific combination of intelligence and wariness that comes from a lifetime of having to read the intentions of strangers very quickly and accurately. She told him they had not had any ministry in some time. She did not say how long. Drummond spoke with her for perhaps half an hour. He later reconstructed the conversation in his journal as carefully as he could, aware that it was the most significant conversation he had ever had, aware also that he had not been prepared for it in any way that mattered. The woman, she did not give her name, a detail that Drummond noted and tried not to draw conclusions from, answered his questions about her congregation's spiritual welfare with great care. She told him they had prayer among themselves, that there were those who knew the scriptures well enough to lead the others, that they managed in the ways people manage when they have only themselves to rely on. She said this without bitterness and without particular emphasis, simply as a statement of fact. When Drummond asked where he was, which seemed to confuse her in a way he didn't immediately understand, she asked him to clarify what he meant, which made him realize that the question of what county or what property this was might genuinely be one she could not answer with certainty. She told him it was Virginia. She told him the land had trees and water and a road at its far edge that sometimes had people on it. She told him these things as if they were the relevant coordinates of the world, which, in her circumstances, they were. Drummond gave what service he could: prayer, conversation, what he carried with him in his saddlebag in the way of practical goods, and then continued on his way. He debated with himself for the following several days about what he had seen and what, if anything, his obligations were. He was not an abolitionist. He was not a political man. He was, by his own account, a man who tried to live within the arrangements of his society while serving his God as best he understood how. But what he had seen nagged at him. Not the existence of enslaved people working land, that was not, to his enormous shame, something that struck him as exceptional. What nagged at him was the absence. No overseer, no clear property owner, no connection to any named estate or family. These people existed in a kind of administrative nowhere, with no one officially responsible for them. Which meant, among other things, no one officially accountable for what happened to them. He wrote a letter to the Methodist Conference in Richmond. He described what he had seen without speculating on its legal implications, and asked whether the conference had any information about charitable or missionary work being done in that part of the county. He received a polite reply 2 weeks later, informing him that no such work was currently being conducted and expressing confidence that the people he described were no doubt properly situated on a legally held property and receiving appropriate care. He wrote a second letter. This one he addressed to a member of the state legislature whose name he knew, a man with a reputation for at least nominal concern for the welfare of enslaved people, in the more formal sense of ensuring that they were not subject to conditions that might create social disorder. This letter was returned to him unopened, with a notation on the envelope that the gentleman was traveling and not receiving correspondence. He wrote a third letter to a newspaper in Richmond. This letter was not published. In June of 1851, Drummond's presiding elder, a man named Augustus Fell, summoned him to a meeting in Charlottesville and informed him, with evident discomfort, that Drummond's circuit assignment was being changed, effective immediately. He would be moving to a circuit in the far southwest of the state, near the Kentucky border. The reassignment had been requested, Fell told him, by several prominent members of the Methodist Conference who had concerns about Drummond's conduct on his current circuit. He was not more specific than that. Drummond went. He was a man who believed in institutional authority, who had spent his life working within structures he had not built and could not, by himself, dismantle. But before he left, he paid one more visit to the western quarter of Greystone County. The clearing was empty. The rough structures were still standing, but they had been stripped of whatever had been in them. The garden plot had been turned over, the well covered with planks. Whatever had been there was gone. He later wrote in his personal journal, a document that survived in the possession of his family and was eventually donated to a Methodist archive, that the speed with which the clearing had been emptied disturbed him more than anything else he had witnessed. "It required foreknowledge," he wrote. "Someone knew I had written those letters before any of those letters could have been answered. The only explanation I can conceive is that someone who received one of my communications informed the relevant parties of what I had written, and those parties acted with an efficiency that suggests they had long anticipated the need to do precisely this." He paused in his journal and then wrote, "I have no power in this matter. I do not know that any power available to me would be sufficient to the task. I write this so that the fact of what I witnessed will survive, should the day ever come when surviving is enough." This is the part of the story where most people would expect an investigation to begin. A man of the cloth had written letters. He had documented what he saw. He had made his concerns known through official channels. But in Virginia in 1851, the question was never whether someone would investigate. It was who had the power to ensure that no investigation ever took place, and whether that power was sufficient. If this story is getting under your skin, if you're starting to understand why certain kinds of records go missing and why certain men died so quietly, hit that like button. Leave us a comment with your theories, and let's keep going together. Because the map was still out there, and someone still knew where to find it. The man who connected all of it, the hidden map, the iron key symbol, the parallel record-keeping system, and the clearing in the Western Quarter, was not Elias Corder, though Corder had come closest. He was a younger man, a lawyer's clerk named Festus Albright, who had grown up in Greystone County, left for Richmond at 18, and returned in 1854 at the age of 28 to settle his deceased mother's estate. Albright's mother had been the widow of a man who worked the county records office in an unofficial capacity before Pruitt's tenure, a kind of deputy clerk who handled overflow work during busy periods. She had kept, in a wooden box in her bedroom, a collection of her late husband's papers. Not official documents, but the small debris of a working life. Notes, drafts, the correspondence, the things a man accumulates when his work involves handling other people's papers day after day. Among those papers, Albright found a letter. It was addressed to his father and dated 1834, 13 years before Corder's visit. It was from a man named Renwick Holloway, and it explained in language that was careful but not carefully enough coded what the iron key symbol meant and why the map behind the frame had been placed there. Holloway was, Albright determined after a week of cross-referencing the county deed books, a land agent who had worked for a consortium of families in the 1820s and 1830s. He had been, in essence, the architect of the parallel system, the man who had designed the arrangement by which the 400 acres and several similar parcels in neighboring counties were kept out of the official record while remaining fully functional as managed properties. The letter to Albright's father was, Holloway explained in it, a kind of insurance policy. He was writing it because he had come to distrust the men he worked for. Specifically, he had come to fear that if the arrangement ever came under scrutiny, if any official inquiry ever reached the point where someone needed to be held accountable, the families would sacrifice him without hesitation. He was not a man of their standing. He had no political protection. He would be the one left explaining documents that carried other men's instructions, but his own signature. He had hidden the map, he wrote, and sent copies of several key documents, the original survey plat, the private deed instruments, the financial records of the arrangement, to a small number of trusted intermediaries, of whom Albright's father was one. He had done this not with any intention of immediate exposure, but as a deterrent. The families knew that he had placed these documents in other hands. As long as they understood that destroying him would not destroy the evidence, they had reason to leave him alone. It had worked for a while. Holloway had died in 1839 of what the county records called inflammation of the lungs. He was 51. His letter to Albright's father had been written in the winter of 1834, 5 years before his death, and whether that death was natural or assisted by the families he had worked for is a question that the record cannot resolve. What the letter contained, what Albright now held in his hands, sitting in his dead mother's bedroom in the house where he had grown up, was not a general description of the scheme. It was specific. It named names. It listed the families involved, their respective financial stakes in the arrangement, the amounts paid, the years the payments were made. It described the system of private instruments, the deeds that were never filed, the surveys that were never recorded, and explained how they circulated among the families, each holding copies of the relevant documents, none holding all of them, so that no single man possessed evidence sufficient to implicate the others. And it described what the 400 acres were for. They were a way station, a managed space where enslaved people who had been transferred between estates in circumstances that the families preferred not to document could be held, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, until the next stage of whatever transaction was being conducted could be completed. Men and women who were being sold in ways that violated the terms of earlier contracts. People whose presence on a named estate would create legal complications because they had been listed as collateral on a debt, or because their sale would require a public record that might attract attention, or because their legal status was complicated by provisions in an old will that had not been fully honored. The 400 acres allowed these transactions to occur in a space that did not legally exist. People could move through it without appearing in any record. Transactions could be completed without triggering any of the legal mechanisms that the official system would have required. It was not, in the terminology of its architects, a place where anything happened. It was a place where things happened between happenings. Albright sat for a long time with Holloway's letter. He was a lawyer's clerk. He understood the value of a document. He also understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had grown up in that county and had come back to it as an adult, what the men named in that letter were capable of, and what the distance was between his own position and theirs. He did not go to the county courthouse, and he did not go to the circuit court in the next county. He did not write to the newspaper in Richmond, having presumably heard what had happened to Drummond's letter 3 years earlier. He copied the letter 3 times in his own hand and sent the copies to 3 separate people in 3 separate cities, with instructions that they were not to be opened or acted upon unless Albright himself failed to contact them within 60 days. Then he went to see Harwell Pruitt. The meeting between Albright and Pruitt was never directly documented, but its outcome is recoverable from circumstantial evidence. Within 2 weeks of Albright's return to the county, the boundary dispute that had brought him there, his mother's estate, was resolved entirely in his favor, without litigation, by a quiet agreement among the affected parties, and within a month, Albright had left the county and returned to Richmond, where he took a position with a law firm that was notable mainly for having no connections to Greystone County or its prominent families. He never wrote publicly about what he had found. He never filed any legal action. He never sent the copies of Holloway's letter to anyone beyond the 3 recipients who held them as insurance. But he kept his own copy. And when he died in 1891 at the age of 65, his papers, including Holloway's letter and Albright's handwritten copies of it, along with a brief personal account of his meeting with Pruitt, passed to his daughter, who was a woman of considerable intelligence and very little patience for the arrangements of powerful men. She took the papers to a journalist in 1893. The journalist published a story on not in Richmond, where the family still had reach, but in a newspaper in Philadelphia, at a time when the family's political power was considerably diminished and several of their principal members were already dead. The story ran in 3 installments, named the families involved, and reproduced substantial portions of Holloway's letter. The response in Virginia was what might be predicted: denial, a few heated letters to other newspapers, and a silence that gradually thickened into the kind of settled historical forgetting that powerful institutions are very good at maintaining. No one was prosecuted. No legal action was taken. The families whose names appeared in Holloway's letter, or their surviving descendants, issued no public statements. And the map itself, the hidden map that Elias Corder had pulled from behind the frame in 1847, was never recovered. When the county records room was reorganized and its holdings transferred to a newer facility in the 1880s, the large map from the courthouse wall was cataloged and moved. The frame was discarded. Whether the hidden map had already been removed, by Pruitt, by someone acting on the family's instructions, or by some other party in the 40 years between Corder's visit and the reorganization, no record shows. It was simply not there. Just when we thought the worst of it was contained in a single county, in a single set of documents. The deeper you go into this story, the more you realize that what happened in Greystone wasn't an aberration. It was a system. And systems don't leave clean endings. Watch, if this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our work, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear so you never miss a story like this. Let's find out together what happened to the land, and to the people who were never supposed to be recorded. The 400 acres in the western quarter of Greystone County were eventually absorbed into neighboring properties in the years after the Civil War. The legal mechanisms by which this occurred are characteristically somewhat obscure. A combination of adverse possession claims, state land grants in the Reconstruction period, and the kind of quiet transaction that takes place when no one withstanding to contest it is in a position to know they should. The rough structures that Drummond had found in 1851 had long since collapsed or been dismantled. The well was filled in. The garden plot had returned to scrub and then to young-growth timber. By the 1880s, a man walking that land would have found very little to suggest that it had ever been anything other than overgrown Piedmont forest, second-growth oak and hickory coming back in, where the light was good, the soil still thin and reddish and exhausted. Elias Corder died in 1879 in a different state. Having never returned to Greystone County and having never made public any of his findings about the hidden map. His private notebooks, the ones his daughter eventually donated to a historical archive, contain the fullest surviving account of what he saw and what he was able to reconstruct. They are careful, precise documents. They're written in the same methodical hand that he used for his survey field journals. At no point do they speculate beyond what the available evidence supports. At one point, near the end of the final notebook, Corder wrote a single paragraph that stands out from the rest of the text. I have been asked, on occasion, what I believe happened to those people. The ones on the land, the ones who existed in no record. I do not know. I have no way of knowing. That is the point of the arrangement, and it is the cruelest part of it. Not merely that they were held in that condition, but that the arrangement was specifically designed to ensure that no one would ever have cause to look for them. You cannot investigate a disappearance that has not been officially acknowledged as a disappearance. You cannot account for lives that were never counted in the first place." He wrote nothing more on the subject after that paragraph. The journalist who published the 1893 story in Philadelphia, a woman named Harriet Copeland Marsh, one of the relatively few female journalists working at a major American newspaper at the time, pursued the story for 2 additional years after the initial publication, attempting to locate any surviving testimony from people who had been held on the 400 acres or who had passed through it. She found very little. A few fragments of oral history passed down through families in the county that referred obliquely to the land in the western quarter as a place people didn't go near and didn't discuss. An elderly man in a county town who told her that his grandfather had once said that the worst thing about certain kinds of secrets was not that they were hidden, but that hiding them required so many people's cooperation, and that cooperation, once given, was very hard to withdraw. Copeland Marsh's follow-up articles were never published. She left the newspaper in 1895 for reasons that her colleagues at the time described as personal, but that she herself, in a letter to a friend, attributed to the fact that her editor had received several visits from men she described only as connected, in ways I could not fully trace, to the Virginia interests I had been writing about. She kept her research notes. They passed, along with her other papers, and through 2 generations of her family before being donated to a university archive in the 1960s. They remain there, available to researchers, in a collection that sees perhaps a dozen visitors a year. The hidden map was never found. In the county that was once called Greystone, a county that still exists, still has a courthouse, still has a records room where deed books line the shelves, there is no official acknowledgement of any of this history. There is no plaque, no historical marker, no notation in the county's published histories. The land in the western quarter has changed hands several times since the Reconstruction period. It is currently divided among several private owners, none of whom, so far as anyone has been able to determine, knows what the land was used for 150 years ago, and the families whose names appear in Holloway's letter are known. Some of their descendants still live in the region. Whether any of them know what their ancestors built and what it was used for is not a question that history has found a way to answer. What history has found, what the accumulated fragments of Corder's notebooks, Holloway's letter, Drummond's journal, and Copeland Marsh's research allow us to see, is the shape of the arrangement. The extraordinary effort required to remove a piece of land and the people on it from every official record. The network of powerful men needed to maintain that removal over decades. The series of deaths and reassignments and suppressed letters that attended every moment when the arrangement came close to the surface. And at the center of it, always, that symbol on the hidden map, with the iron key, meaning this door opens from the inside only by those who already hold the key. Meaning, what is inside here does not need to be known by anyone outside. Meaning, this land, and everything on it, belongs to a different system of accounting, one that runs parallel to the official record, never touching it, never visible to anyone who doesn't already know where to look. Elias Corder looked. He pulled the map from the frame and found the other map behind it. He saw what it showed, and he understood enough of what it meant to spend the next 3 decades quietly documenting it, and not quite enough to know what to do with what he found. That is the thing about certain kinds of hidden histories. The people who discover them are rarely in a position to fully expose them, and the people who created them counted on that, very carefully, from the very beginning. The map that Corder found in 1847 showed a piece of land that officially did not exist. It showed roads that were never built and property lines that appeared in no deed book, and a 400-acre parcel that bore no name but only the image of a key. Somewhere in the hills of central Virginia, that land still exists. The trees are different now. The structures are gone. The well is filled. But the land is still there, still bounded by the same watercourses that Holloway's survey identified. Still rising toward the same distant ridge of the Blue Ridge that the people who lived on it could see from the edges of the clearing. They have left no record. That was the whole point. But we know, in the fragmentary, incomplete, always insufficient way that history ever knows anything, that they were there. This mystery shows us something that goes far beyond one county in Virginia, or one hidden map, or one surveyor who happened to notice a frame that was thicker than it needed to be. It shows us how deliberately and skillfully certain truths can be buried, not by accident, not by the simple passage of time, but by people who understood exactly what they were doing and had every resource they needed to do it well. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or is there more buried beneath those Virginia hills that no one has yet managed to pull into the light? Leave your comment below. We read every single one. If you want more stories like this one,
don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would, but pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection. Now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone again. I'm freezing. I'm bleeding. slowly fading away. But don't worry, I'm fine. The cold has settled in my heartbeat, like winter living in my veins. Every breath feels numb and fragile, every smile just hides the pain. I'm breaking quietly in silence, falling slow without a sound. Yet I keep saying I'm okay, while my world burns to the ground. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. Maybe pain just learned to live here, maybe sorrow feels like home. So I wear my wounds like armor and survive them all alone. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. If you ever see me smiling, no, it's just my last defense. 'Cause sometimes love means hiding how much you're suffering. No, I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. It's okay.